This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. Now, a quick reminder for those of you listening in Boston or know folks in Boston, we are doing our first ever live show on September 13th, Friday, September 13th. Tickets are available now for that show. You can find a link in the show notes or on our social media. All right, let's get into the episode. This day, August 11th, 1965, a confrontation between cops and a 21-year-old black man, as well as his mother, sparked 6 days of civil unrest in Los Angeles. This would come to be known as the Watts Riots. Some 14,000 members of the California National Guard flood into LA to suppress the disturbance. There's 34 deaths, over $40 million in property damage. President Johnson offers remarks. MLK visits California and speaks to the residents on the ground. A year later, civil rights leader Bayard Rustin would kind of frame it this way, which is really interesting. He says the whole point of the outbreak in Watts was that it marked the first major rebellion of Negroes against their own masochism and was carried on with the express purpose of asserting that they would no longer quietly submit to the deprivation of slum life. So let's talk about Watts, summer 1965. Pick up on that framing from Bayard Rustin. Here, as always, to do that, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Before we get to the TikTok of how the riots went down, I am very curious about Rustin's framing there. The first major rebellion of Negroes, as he puts it. Kellie, can you give us a little of that 1965 context? I mean, every time we talk about this era, I feel like it's so important to say, like, 1964 is very different from 1965. It's very different from 66. It's very obviously different from 67, which is known as the long, hot summer, where there's a lot of... But so, you know, what do we need to know about specifically 1965, specifically California, the civil rights movement, so forth?
Yeah, I mean, this is... It's so funny that I think of the word rebellion and I think of like Elizabeth Hinton's book, America on Fire, where she calls all of these, a combination of these riots, rebellions, because that's essentially what they are. You know, you were living in a period in which people have gotten, you know, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but those acts don't put food on the table. Those acts haven't created jobs. Those acts haven't fundamentally changed life for people on the ground. And so what a lot of Americans are experiencing, particularly in California during this time, is this swift backlash to say, like, actually, this wasn't the solution. This wasn't what we needed or what we asked for. We needed jobs. We need food. We need, you know, relief from police brutality. And so all of these things are bubbling up to the surface. And yeah, I think rebellion is the proper word for it. I think it's MLK that also says, a riot is the language of the unheard, that these are people who have sort of been silenced or left behind or forgotten about, and they are angry. And this rebellion represents that anger.
And I think it's important just to underscore Kellie's point about, like, rights are not enough. This comes less than a week after Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act. So you've just had this, like, major landmark piece of civil rights legislation. And we'll get to this when we talk about the backlash. But, like, there's this sense that, like, yes, we have new security for these rights, although obviously it hasn't been enforced yet. But it's not enough. It doesn't do anything about deprivation, and it doesn't do anything about slumlords, and it doesn't do anything about the LAPD. Yes. Which under Police Chief William Parker was one of the most racist, most corrupt, most violent police forces in the country. And that is going to be a big source of the conflict that's happening in Watts. There had been a number of moments of police brutality that had led to smaller uprisings and protest. But specifically in August of 1965, 21-year-old Marquette Fry, he's pulled over, allegedly driving while under the influence. He fails the field sobriety test. His mom is in a nearby house. She comes over, and it turns into a conflict between Marquette Fry's family and the police, and a crowd gathers. People are arrested, and all of that anger and frustration that Kellie was talking about bubbles over into an ongoing 6 days of rebellion.
I keep coming back to that phrase, the deprivation of slum life, that Rustin uses, because again, we've talked. It's like so important to think about the high-minded ideals, or the material. There are material consequences to the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights legislation, but to then also just put it in those plain terms of like the deprivation of day-to-day life, and that is what is animating. When are conditions going to change? How does this actually affect what's happening on the ground itself?
And I think this is also a big part of MLK's shift as well, because he starts talking about class more. He starts talking about the Poor People's Campaign. He starts saying, like, actually, we've gotten civil rights on the cheap. It hasn't cost the federal government anything to create these changes, to create voting rights protection, to have, an end to segregation. Does not actually change the socioeconomic wealth for Black people. It doesn't close the wealth gap. It doesn't allow people more opportunities for, promotion and prosperity. And Black cities in particular have been left out of that. I mean, you have all of these businesses that have left the city. There's great divestment. So unemployment is high, crime is high, all of the things that you would expect to see in a city that has been divested from is what Watts and larger LA looks like. And LA, this could really be, and it later becomes, in a lot of other cities. You see this in Detroit, you see this in, in Chicago, you see this in Washington, D.C. Like, it's all emblematic of what happens when cities are not invested in and Black communities are left behind.
Yeah.
And that war on deprivation is taking place sort of physically during these 6 days. When you look at where the arsons were happening and where the looting was happening, it was largely local white-owned stores and businesses that were a source of a lot of resentment in the neighborhood, in large part because the thing that was happening in these poor communities, you see this happening in poor communities all over the country, that you have these businesses whose money doesn't stay in the community, who pay very low wages and who charge very high prices. And so that kind of like sort of poor tax that comes with having to shop in these neighborhoods, there is this real sense, like, why do things cost more? Why aren't we paid more? Why aren't these Black-owned businesses? That all sort of comes out in the targets of the property destruction that happens over the course of Watts.
Kellie, do you have we've talked about this a bunch, but I'm just curious. Do you have a further thought about how you think about this thing? As we could talk about the backlash, but this is obviously, you hear that charge of like, why would you burn down your own community? If you're upset.
Yeah. Well, if you don't own your community, then I think that's it right there. I mean, if you don't own these businesses, you're not destroying something that is yours. And because Black people did not have large ownership over the grocery stores that they used, the shopping malls that they used, even their homes to some extent, if you're renting, you don't have ownership over that, the very communities that you live in. And so there's always this push of, why would you burn it? Why would you destroy it? Well, it's not mine. It's not. And it sends a powerful message to those who are in positions of power and ownership that, like, when you are not in partnership with the community, you are vulnerable to violence.
This is sort of crudely put, but I also just sometimes my reaction is like, what do you expect people to like get on a bus and go across town and burn a McDonald's there? You just sort of, it's an expression of something, and it's in the physical space where that deprivation is being felt. We don't need to do a ton on the like actual way that this riot plays out, because unfortunately it is a lot of the same beats that we see in a lot of the other incidents and the episodes that we've done on this. But, the National Guard comes in. The response is basically bring down the hammer from the police, arrests. The vast majority of people who are killed by the police or the National Guard. And, it then eventually just kind of begins to die down. I want to move to unless you have other thoughts about the sort of riots themselves, I do want to move to the kind of backlash and framing after the fact, because I do think that is interesting here, and also, again, sort of sets the table for so much of how the conversation about this kind of violence and uprising would play out over the course of the rest of the decade.
So I think that the story of backlash, if we could take it to just a beat before that, there is a commission that is organized right after the Watts Rebellion, and it looks at why did this happen? Mm-hmm. And the answers that it comes up with is very high unemployment, very poor schools, very poor living conditions. We need to put in place all of these reforms in order to make life better for the people who live in Watts. So that's one argument for what you do.
Can we linger on that for a second?
Yeah.
Because that is, to me, pretty remarkable. So this is a commission that is headed by the former CIA director. It's December 1965. The former CIA director, John McCone. I don't know too much about John McCone, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say he's not the wokest guy in the world, right? And his commission, their recommendations in the wake of these riots are, well, here's some things that could address this issue. How about emergency literacy and preschool programs? Better police community ties, upgraded healthcare services, more efficient public transportation. This is a commission led by a former CIA director that is offering pretty nuanced and holistic, and I would say progressive recommendations. I mean, I just think it's a kind of remarkable artifact.
Yeah.
It is, and it also wasn't implemented.
Well, yes.
Right? You stood at a kind of political crossroads in 1965, 1966, and you have, again, the former CIA director saying, let's go this one way. And then you have gubernatorial candidate Ronald Reagan saying, you want an end to this violence? Lock them up.
Yep.
Use force to eradicate violence in the cities, more police powers, creating fear that Black people are inherently violent and dangerous, calling the city a jungle, talking about this as sort of the aftermath of the extremism and lawlessness of the Black civil rights movement. And that's the message that wins in California. Ronald Reagan becomes a two-term governor. He ultimately becomes a two-term president. And again, like the McCone Commission ideas and policy recommendations aren't implemented. So
Right.
you have a choice between dealing with the root causes or making white people feel better.
Or just pushing it to the side. I mean, because
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, when you think about these reforms that McCone is pushing, for a lot of white people, it feels like a reward. It feels like, oh, well, you burn down these businesses, you destroy these properties, and now you get funding for schools, and now you get funding for jobs, and now and now we're putting money into your community. You know, you don't get a reward. You're undeserving. And so that narrative is so powerful of like the undeserving poor that people would much rather throw people away than invest in their success. And that's one that you see replicated over and over again, which is why, you know, King always talks about like this is civil rights on the cheap. Like no one wants to actually pay for what change could look like.
And of course, the dynamic that you just described, it's exactly what ended up playing, I think, in a much more high-profile way with the Kerner Commission, 4 or 5 years later, which we've done episodes on, but that was that big high-profile commission that was in 1967 about what is the root cause of all these riots after the long, hot summer of 67, and it comes out with some pretty holistic recommendations about, you know, systemic racism and resources deprivation in communities, and it largely gets ignored as well. And so we see a sort of mini version of that play out within the aftermath of Watts.
It's funny too because this comes a few years later, but when you get the first Black Panther Party that starts, I mean, they are the response, the solution to a lot of this is they say, you know what, we're going to feed our communities. You won't feed us, we'll feed ourselves. You won't protect us, we will do the cop watch and the police watch. And they create all of these programs to combat, you know, what the McCone Commission was trying to institute in the first place. And it just, even that gets undermined. I mean, the Black Panther Party gets undermined deeply because of COINTELPRO, but the solutions all get shortcut.
Yeah. And I suppose as a counter to that, the other entity that rises out of this, and maybe this reshapes California politics, and Reagan enters the 66 governor's race, kind of explicitly talking about how he's going to be tough on quashing these kind of dissents.
Yeah, it's the roadmap not only for Reagan, but just as the McCone Commission is sort of the precursor to the Kerner Commission report, Reagan's rise also is sort of the precursor to Richard Nixon's Law and Order campaign and his 1.5 terms as president.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. I'm glad we finally got to talking about the Watts riots. Let's do a couple other things that happened on this day, August 11th, throughout the years. So middle of the summer or middle of the late summer, August 11th, 2020. Remember 2020? Democrat Joe Biden. Remember Joe Biden? He names California Senator Kamala Harris. Remember Kamala Harris? He names her as his running mate. Harris, of course, the first black woman on a major party's presidential ticket, and now the first black woman at the top of a presidential ticket.
What a 4 years.
What a 4 years.
I know. 4 years. My goodness. These are dog years, y'all.
No kidding. It's been a dog week.
Yeah, I know. In 1992, the Mall of America, the nation's largest shopping entertainment center, opened in Bloomington, Minnesota. I can't tell you how much time I have spent at the Mall.
I was going to ask if either of you have been.
Tons of times. I've done the roller coaster. I've done everything. I used to live in North Dakota, so the Mall of America was like where we went for good times.
Amazing.
So I've been
the closest entertainment.
Yes.
I've never been, and honestly, like the list of things that like in the United States that I haven't kind of gotten a chance to see is pretty small, I would say. Like I've just been to all 50 states. I've seen a lot, traveled around, but I've never been to the Mall of America. It's like literally it's like Glacier National Park and the Mall of America are like the two things I'm like,
which will you get to first?
I know. Am I not missing much?
I don't think you're missing much. No, I mean,
which will go extinct first, glaciers or malls?
I know.
All right. And on this day in 1997, Bill Clinton made the first use of the historic line item veto. He rejected 3 items in spending and tax bills. Probably the last president to use it, too, because the U.S. Supreme Court would strike down the line item veto as unconstitutional.
No. We should do an episode on the veto in general. We'll find a reason to do that. But that brings us to the end of this episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
It began with police and rioters clashing on a hot Wednesday night. Some believe it could have been stopped right then if law officers moved in force and sealed off the area. Perhaps so, perhaps not. But within a matter of hours, it was completely out of hand. More than 1,500 people were in the streets, many hurling rocks and bottles at the police or anyone else, some attacking the cars of people, white or Negro, who just passed by. More than 100 police rushed to the area, sealing off 8 square blocks in an effort at quarantine.
Radiotopia.